Hear me okay in the back?
Yes.
First I want to say thank you for asking me to come to this beautiful part of the world, this beautiful church. Phenomenal music. And Lisa, thank you for your hospitality. Ed and Jan, thank you for the nice meal. And Jan, I want to say a special thanks to you for being a supporter, a fan, and a friend for a long time. Thanks for having me. I'm going to start out, if there are any Greater Bostonians here that can translate for the people nearby, although the Maine accent is probably not that far away. I'm going to start out with a little prelude. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about my dad, even though he's not the subject of what I want to say today. He was a working class Italian-American kid from Revere, Massachusetts, graduated from high school with great grades, and unfortunately in the depth of the Depression, the third of 8 kids, the first 2 kids hadn't been able to even finish high school, so my dad couldn't go to college. He had to go to work to help support the family. He worked picking carrots on a farm for 25 cents an hour, and eventually he went to school to be a draftsman and worked for an engineering firm for a while. Went into politics, became a city councilor, went into bigger politics and became friends with a couple of Republican governors. I think if he knew my politics, probably he'd be turning in his grave, but he was a great guy. And the point of it is that he could be friends with anybody. He had friends from Revere who were bookies, who were low-level mafia guys, who were city workers, laborers. He had friends who were senators, judges, governors. Secretary of State of the United States was a personal first-name basis friend of his. And he could talk to all these people. And I think because he saw them as human beings, he didn't see them as Secretary of State, or he didn't see them as a bookie. He just saw them as a human being. And it was a wonderful legacy for all of us in my family. So from him I've inherited a few things. A little bit too much of a temper sometimes. He'd get angry very quickly, and it would pass very quickly, which I hope that part of it's true for me. He had a tremendous determination. He went to law school when he was 50 without a college degree, without any college education, with 3 sons and a full-time job, and became a lawyer when he was 60 and died peacefully in his sleep when he was 66. I haven't inherited that much of the determination, but I think a little bit of it. And I've also inherited, and this is what leads into what I want to talk about today, this tendency to be comfortable talking to different kinds of people and to like talking to different kinds of people. A lot of times I'll be in the supermarket and I'm waiting in line, I'll have a conversation with somebody, and one of my daughters will say, "Dad, do you know her?" "No, I don't know her." "What are you talking to for?" "Do you know that guy?" "No, I never met him before in my life." So that can have a positive side, and it can have a negative side. And so this little bit here is the negative side. I do a lot of traveling, sometimes for work, sometimes to see my family who still live in Revere. And one night after a trip like this, I was coming home on the Mass Pike, probably 11:30 at night, a little bit tired, and there's one last rest stop before you head up Route 91 and toward where we live. And I pulled into that rest area, and I wanted to get a bottle of water and a bag of cashews or something. And I parked my car, and I got out, and a box truck parked next to me. These 2 guys got out, and I'm walking into the restaurant, and one of the guys says, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah." I figured he was going to say, "How do you get to Greenfield?" or something. And he said, "Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior?" And I think we all know the kind of person, or where that's coming from when someone asks you that in a parking lot at 11 o'clock at night. most people I know would just say, yeah, thank you, and see you later, I gotta hurry, I gotta get home to my kids, or something like that. But because of what I inherited from my father, I stopped to talk to this guy, much to my regret. And I said, look, I'm a very religious person, and I respect you, but I just have a different way of talking about those things. I have a different way of thinking about those things. And he said, well, you're going to go to hell. You're damned, you're going to go to hell, and you're going to burn forever unless you accept Jesus Christ. So at that point, the other 5% of people who already wouldn't have walked away would have walked away. But I stopped to continue the conversation, and I said, look, all right. I said, there's a kid in China. He's a 10-year-old kid, never hurt anybody in his life, wonderful to his parents, wonderful to his siblings, goes and sees his grandparents every day and brings them food. He's walking to school one day, a little bit distracted, gets hit by a train and killed. Are you telling me that your all-loving, all-merciful God is going to condemn that boy to burn in the fire of hell for all eternity with no hope of getting out? The guy said, yes. I said, well, how can that be? I mean, he said, because the boy's cursed. I said, the boy grew up 1,000 miles from the nearest Bible. How's he going to accept Jesus Christ as his personal Savior? He said, he's cursed, he's going to hell, he's going to burn forever. I said, well, that's no God for me. And the guy went absolutely crazy. He started to yell, he started to wave his arms, kind of get in my face a little bit. I had taken a few years of karate, I was trying to remember what you're doing. You know, and luckily his friend grabbed him, and at that point finally I gave up on the conversation and walked away, never saw the guy again. And I don't even know why that came to me when I knew I wanted to talk about Yin Yang today, and for some reason I thought of that gentleman in the parking lot in Ludlow. I think maybe because a lot of martial arts schools have the Yin Yang as a symbol, you know, and I was remembering my karate days. And everyone here probably knows the Yin Yang is a circle with a wavy line through it, and one side is black with a white dot, and the other side is white with a black dot. It's an ancient Chinese symbol, often associated with Taoism and the Tao Te Ching. Confucius used it, and it represents balance in life. I think it's a beautiful, very simple way of describing the complexity of life. Night and day, male and female, old and young, birth and death, sickness and health. You can go on and on with hundreds and hundreds of ways that life. I was thinking this morning, looking out at the ocean, you know, some days that ocean is absolutely calm and peaceful and calming, and other days it's raging. But the way I want to use the Yin Yang today is to talk about interior and exterior when it comes to spirituality. I grew up a Catholic in a very devout family, went to church every Sunday for 20-some years, every holy day, confession, communion, confirmation, rosary, novenas, the whole thing. And I'm not a Catholic anymore. I have some parts of that church that are, I almost want to use the word abhorrent to me, but some parts I just disagree with, I guess. And other parts I really still am glad that I was exposed to listening to the Bible every Sunday for all those years, and a lot of charitable works. Just as I'm sure the reason you're here, just a little bit of time every Sunday to think about the bigger questions and not be thinking about my next Little League game or some girl I wanted to look at and ask out and have the courage, or, you know, a fight I had with a kid at school or something like that. Later on in life, not to be thinking about bills and worries and plans for vacation, and just spend a little time every week thinking about something different. That was very valuable to me. But it strikes me now that Catholicism and Christianity are really exterior-oriented religions in the way we practice them now. And I think that makes sense because really Christianity, although I'm not a religious historian, but I don't think it started out this way, but it's really been adopted or co-opted by the Western world. If you look at the Christian countries in the world, it's mostly the Western world. I'm going to generalize here today, but mostly the Western world. And the Western world is a very external world. Our culture is an extremely external culture. More than any culture ever in the history of humankind, I think we are able to manipulate the world to suit us. We build these spectacular roads and buildings. We send missiles, satellites into space. I have this phone here that I'm hoping is recording what I'm saying. And I can take a picture with that phone and send it to my daughter in Italy in 3 seconds. It's really miraculous. And the medicines and medical treatments that we've developed, really just amazing, remarkable, and I think we're all proud of that in a certain part of our being, and we should be. But if we could step back a little bit from our own way of living, which is very difficult to do, what we would also see in that Western world is a tremendous amount of violence, an incredible amount of addiction of all kinds, depression, a large amount of mental illness, abuse, and real degradation of the environment to suit the lifestyle that we have. I think if we're honest with ourselves, those are the two halves of that yin yang. We have to say, yes, we have a great society, we've done these great things. We also have to look at the other side and say, okay, within these great things, all this stuff that we take for granted, is that just natural to human life? Or does that have something to do with the way we live? So, as I said, I was Catholic all those years, and when I began to drift away from the Catholic Church, there was kind of a halfway house for Catholics who were drifting away. There was a church, and some people might know of it, and right on Boston Common called the Paulist Center. Very progressive, I would say radical Catholic church in those days. They used to invite homeless people in to sleep on the pews. And the doors are no longer open. I've tried to, but they used to be open. It used to be you could just walk in and say a prayer. And they had centering prayer retreats, and they also had in the time I was there, a discussion group of Thomas Merton's work. And that was my introduction to him. And I remember vividly reading in one of his, I think it was in the Thomas Merton Reader, it was called, the phrase, the interior life. And it was, I was just knocked back on my heels by that, the interior life. Oh, so that's what's been going on all these years, all this stuff inside me, this thinking about life and death, musing, wondering why the world is the way it is. That's the interior life. Someone had finally named that for me. And it was a huge favor that I think he did for a lot of people to focus on that, especially as a Christian to focus on that. And he also exposed me and millions of other people to the wisdom of the East, which when I was a boy growing up as a Catholic, that was verboten. That was strogo vostriščino, as the Russians say. It was vietato, as the Italians say. It was forbidden. It was just not to be done, that you would be inclusive in your thinking about any other religion. You know, the Catholics had, and I think Christians can sometimes, probably not in this church, be guilty of that and say, you know, Christ is God, and these other people are worshiping some false somebody or other, you know. Incredibly conceited attitude, I think. What if we had been born in one of those places? Would we still have that attitude? I mean, it's just amazing to me. And Merton helped open my eyes to that by saying, okay, I practice Zen meditation. He's a Catholic monk, he's a Trappist monk. I want to someday meet with the Dalai Lama, which he did. I want to meet with some of these mystics and solitary holy people from the East and see what they have to say. It was a beautiful open-mindedness that he had. It made a great impression on me. And what I think I discovered for me personally in that, as I began to read Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, I went on retreats with some of the Buddhist teachers, especially Tibetan Buddhists, was that there was a religion that focused on the interior. And they came out of cultures that focused on the interior. So if you take Tibet as the most perfect example, They don't have beautiful buildings with the one tremendous exception in Lhasa. They certainly don't have skyscrapers. They don't have great roads. They haven't developed these, they can't do lung transplants. They can't send satellites into space. That's from us. They don't have that. What do they have? They have this deep, profound study of the interior life. So the Dalai Lama begins his days by meditating from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. every day. To us, as Westerners, that's navel-gazing. It's not productive. Who is he helping by meditating every day? He's not developing any new medicine. He's not coming up with solutions to any problems. He's just navel-gazing. That's our attitude. I'm generalizing again. That can be our attitude toward those religions, that practice. But that's very strange to me because Christ, for one example, went into the desert for 40 days, right? What did he do for those 40 days? He was tempted by the devil, if I remember correctly. And I know from experience it takes about 5 seconds to be tempted by the devil. So, and he resisted that temptation. But I mean, 40 days worth? For 40 days he was being tempted and resisting and going this 40-day battle? I don't think so. So I grew up hearing, oh, Christ went into the desert for 40 days. That's why we have Lent. Christ went into the desert for 40 days. But nobody ever said what he did in the desert, beside that one moment with Satan. And I don't know. But if I had to guess, it would be he was in deep meditation. Very similar to the deep meditations that, for example, Native Americans, shamans, will go into the wilderness and go into these deep meditations and not eat and have visions. Tibetan monks will go into the mountains and caves and meditate and go into these deep meditations where they don't eat, they don't sleep. They're, I think, touching God. And I think that's what Christ was saying to Father. I think Christ was communing with the Father, to use biblical terms. Do I know that? No. Am I being presumptuous by saying that? Yes. I don't have a divinity degree. I'm not ordained. I could be totally and completely wrong, in which case the guy in the parking lot will be the person to throw me into hell when I... See, I told you so. But I think that that's what he was doing. I think that was the whole point of going into the desert for 40 days. To prepare himself interiorly for what he knew he had to face, for what he knew was coming. I spent some time in the Peace Corps of Micronesia, which is a place without fancy buildings and without fancy roads and without great medications, but the people had a very deep spirituality, almost pantheism. They were Christians because their missionaries had come, but they would see God in everything, in the leaves of the trees, in the ocean, in the birds, in each other. I lived on an island that you could walk around in 15 minutes. There were 200 people on that island. There hadn't been so much as a fist fight in at least 10 years, or as far as anybody could remember. I said to people, are there ever fight? Well, gee, I don't know, maybe one time, a long time ago, somebody had a fight with somebody else. Not to mention no spousal abuse, addiction, depression, immobilizing depression, and environmental degradation. These are the people we used to call savages. I just want to read a little bit from a famous Buddhist Sutra, one of the most famous Buddhist prayers, actually. And I'll just read a few lines, and it's, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. It is founded on our thoughts. It is made up of our thoughts. If a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain follows him as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that draws the carriage. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. It is founded on our thoughts. It is made up of our thoughts. If a man speaks or acts with a pure thought, happiness follows him like a shadow that never leaves him. And what I think Buddha's great contribution to the spiritual world was this idea that you can actually change your thought process. And by changing your thought process, you can change the way you are in the world. And by changing the way you are in the world, you can change the world. It begins with changing that thought process. And I think, at least the way I grew up, was that this is just the way I think. Maybe everybody thinks this way, you know, but they actually, he was actually, it's a kind of a mental science that there are techniques developed over thousands of years for going into that thought process, changing that thought process, and then that will change what you do in the exterior world. I think the only vestiges of that we have in our society may be Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, maybe psychotherapy, that idea that if you're talking to a therapist, you're revealing your thought process. And the therapist will then take that and say, well, maybe you could think about that a little bit differently. I'm not saying that's exactly the same as meditation, but that's the closest thing we have in the interior world, I think, in the Western culture. I had a friend who just died who was a Trappist monk at Spencer and a hermit like Thomas Merton for 50 years, a Revere kid, a little bit older than I am. And he sent me a book called The Fire Within, which I hesitate to recommend. It's very, I think of the word I think of is religiously. The language is a little bit difficult, but a little bit pious, a little bit saccharine for me. But there were some beautiful ideas in there. One of those ideas was that the interior and exterior world are not separate. So if you behave well in the exterior world, which is what Christianity exhorts us to do, don't sin, then that changes your interior world. Makes your interior world a calmer, quieter, more peaceful place. And if you change your interior world and meditate with the purpose of doing that, that changes the way you act in the exterior world. So what tendency I have toward anger, as I mentioned earlier, toward a temper, I still have that. But because I've meditated for 30 years, I feel like I have it less. I have some control over it. It doesn't happen like that. At least in my case, it didn't happen like that. But the point of that book was wonderful to me because it was that Yin Yang symbol. The two sides, the Yin Yang is separated really not, in most drawings, not separated by a line. It's just the black touches the white. And there's a little black in the white and a little white in the black. So the idea that the interior life is separate from the exterior life is really not the way I like to look at it. Those two things function together. But in my spiritual upbringing, it always was the focus, don't sin, you know. Don't steal, don't talk back to your parents, don't disobey. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's very important to do that. But there was very little focus on where that came from. You know, when you had the impulse to disobey, where did the impulse towards sin, that comes from a thought. And the pattern, that thought has roots. It has a pattern in your mind, and in our minds, and that can be changed. So, I was tempted briefly to get up here at the beginning and just say, I'm not going to say anything. We're just going to sit here quietly for 30 minutes. When I raised that possibility with Jan last night, she said, look, I've taken a lot of time to build up this nice congregation. I don't want people running for the door, you know. But isn't it interesting that, you know, on all these Christian communities around the country, 52 weeks a year, how much time do we ever spend sitting still quietly? A minute, maybe, a couple of minutes, you know. I know the Quakers, the few times I went to Quaker meetings, they would sit there quietly for an hour. It would drive most of us crazy to do that, you know. But that's what they did. Occasionally somebody would pipe up. And sometimes at a meeting there'd be a person who piped up too much. And just would talk about everything they were thinking, which was not exactly the point. But I'm not saying we should run these services anywhere in any church in the country differently. I'm not saying we should not gather as a community, not have external prayer, not give to charity? Of course we should, obviously we should. But I'm just saying that the emphasis on the other side of things, the quiet side, the doing nothing side, what we call navel-gazing side, that's just completely, in most congregations, not there at all. And I think it's anti-Christian. So I'll give two quick examples from what I remember from the Bible. The idea of, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, comes from, I think, at least one of the places it comes from in the Bible is that Jesus says, no one goes to the Father except through me. Something like that. And people interpret that as, okay, you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, or you don't go to the Father, meaning you don't go to heaven. That's one way to look at it. That's a very externally oriented way of looking at that. The internally oriented way of looking at that could be, okay, there's a road from Boston to Springfield. The Mass Pike goes from Boston to Springfield. Springfield's heaven. It isn't really heaven for those people. But let's say it's closer to, for the purposes of this discussion, let's say that Springfield is heaven, okay? And let's say Jesus is on the outskirts of Springfield, you know, on Holy Thursday, the day before he dies, okay? And he's taken this route from Boston to the outskirts of Springfield. And what he's saying to us is, look, if you want to get to Springfield, if you want to get to the Father, if you want to get to heaven, you have to go through me. You have to go through the route that I've taken. The place that I am is here. The mental, interior place that I am is here. Okay? You're still in East Sudbury someplace, okay? If you want to get there, you have to go through me. You have to travel that interior route to get to heaven. Maybe. That would be more my interpretation of no one comes to the Father except through me. And even more so, he said, the kingdom of heaven is within you. In our exterior way of thinking, that means it's within my grasp. I mean, I could do it. If I do everything right, if I go to church every Sunday, if I don't commit sins, if I follow the commandments, if I give to charity, if I raise my children well, I'm good to my lover, husband, wife, whoever, I'll go to heaven. It's within me to do that. That's one legitimate interpretation. The other legitimate interpretation is an interior interpretation. It is within you. The kingdom of heaven is in there. And if you do the work, you get there. If you work on that interior aspect of life. I think that's as legitimate, or maybe for me, a more legitimate interpretation of the kingdom of heaven is within you. It's the kind of phrase I heard all the time growing up, and we just kind of take for granted, oh yeah, the kingdom of heaven is within you. But mystically, what exactly was Jesus meaning by that? So, I guess, in closing, I wish that when the Europeans came to this country, to this land, and brought all the wonderful knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries, you know, the ability to make iron and steel, to navigate, to heal certain kinds of illnesses, all the different studies, language, mathematics, all that wonderful exterior knowledge that they had. When they came here, instead of ultimately crushing the native peoples, slaughtering them, torturing them, herding them off into some of the worst land in the continental United States, I wish they had said, look, we have all this stuff. We can do all this. We can make guns. You know. We can make these ships that sail across the ocean. We can do surgery. I wish they had said that to the native peoples and then said, show us what you can do. But instead they brought this superior attitude toward the external world and ended up slaughtering those people. And maybe the native peoples who were not immune to violence either, I don't want to make it black and white, I don't want to say they were perfect and we were awful, it's just not the case. But they had this understanding of the interior life, and they did not degrade nature to the extent that we do with their, maybe they could, the Europeans could have said to them, show us some of that. Show us how to go off into the trees for 2 or 3 days and maybe get closer to God and come back and have a better understanding of the natural world than we have now. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? And maybe that's still possible, I don't know. Maybe there's some way that the wisdom and incredible achievements of the West can be met, can meet the centuries and millennia of work that the East has done on the interior world and form a really balanced yin yang. Maybe that would be a kind of paradise. Thank you for listening to me.